very interested and always have been in the modern Japanese theater, and one of the figures that has always fascinated me is Senda Koreya. So I want to say something about what I'm working on at the moment. It's sort of a longer project, as you'll discover as we go along, so this is just a little piece of it. But I think he's a very interesting figure, and I think what he went through and the various travails of his life shed a lot of light on modern Japanese social and intellectual history, particularly his early encounter with Marxism. Now, I asked Fred whether, because I'm going to mention the word Marxism, whether I will join the, what do you call them, Dirty 30 or whatever, and Fred said he will collect the $100 if a student wants to report me. But Mr. Senda did go to Germany. I mean, I have to talk about it. So anyhow, but I think that the theater is a very interesting sort of axis at which to look at modern Japanese culture. And I also think personally, I guess it's my own predilections, I'm most fascinated with Japan when I see how Japan interacts with the rest of the world, be it the United States or Europe or China, of course, in Korea and in other periods and so on. But I think for the Japanese, if you want to come at it in this way, that the theater has always been a remarkable sort of space in which people can argue out some of the major events of the day, politically, spiritually, whatever. I don't think that this is, I think it's still pretty much true in Japan. It's certainly true in France, it's true in Germany. It doesn't appear to be true even in New York, and certainly not in Los Angeles, where theater seems to be more entertainment than anything else. But there have been times in history, you can, of course, contradict me, I hope you can. There are times in history, certainly in Japan in the 20th century, where theater had very high aspirations and so forth. And it's very interesting to look at these things, because in this sort of space, you had different kinds of writers, actors, directors, set designers, and so on, all trying to talk about their society and to relate to their audience. And so, in fact, the question of audience is very important to what I want to say later. I'll get back to that in a few minutes. One of the things that seems to me that the theater did and provided this space, if you want to use that word for, was that it allowed a sort of critique of Japanese society to go on in an artistic form. In the pre-war period, and I'll go into this a bit more later, I think Marxism was very important. Right after the war, there were a couple of very powerful and very effective Christian playwrights who used a sort of Christian framework to look at Japanese society. Then you had the sort of anti-bourgeois avant-garde that's still doing all these remarkable things in Japan. And then you had directors in recent years like Ninagawa, who has taken the Greek tragedies and sort of made them into Japanese things to talk about, again, Japanese society from some larger framework than Japan. And if you look at all of these, they have a kind of universalist view. So they lift themselves up from ordinary Japanese concerns and look at Japan from outside. And I think this is really the value of all this sort of thing. The Japanese theater really in the last 20 or 30 years has become one of the most creative in the world. And I would heartily recommend to you Carol Sorgenfrey's wonderful new book on Terayama Shuji, who is one of the great figures of this period, in which she describes some of these activities, and she talks about the enormous vitality that's been going on in the theater, of which she, of course, was a part. And she also makes the distinction between entertainment and theater, which has a purpose, which has a larger idea. And it's sort of within that I want to make these remarks. The other thing is, if you want to locate Senda Koreya in this sort of trajectory of really 100 years, from the early 20th century to the early 21st century, he's an extraordinary kind of bridge between these early experiments and what's going on right now. He lived into his 90s, and of course he was sort of witness to many of these things. And I think he and almost everybody with whom he was associated, and the people who were before and after him, all more or less had the same conviction, which was that a theater production can engage an audience, and that it can make them change their ideas about things so that they will live in a different way. Now, that's a very idealistic idea, one I don't think we have now. Possibly film. If you think of, what is it, Good Night and Good Luck, or the Suryana films like that, people are trying to get at ideas and make the audience think, but it's not what sitcoms do on television, particularly, et cetera, et cetera. There are fewer and fewer places, and it seems to me in contemporary culture, where that's possible. Now, of course, the question is, can you actually do that? Can you, through some sort of artistic form on a stage or a film or whatever, can you make people think and change their minds? Well, that was certainly the thing that all of these theater artists were dedicated to doing. And it was, in a sense, a kind of religious urge, I think. So in trying to see, sort of from the beginnings up to now, who is the central figure, I picked Senda because he's touched on so many things and knew so many people and was such a very gifted person. The beginnings, without spending too much time on this, the beginnings of modern Japanese theater took place roughly 100 years ago, and the playwrights which were first done in Japan and caused enormous interest, and this was with the background of kabuki and things like that. There was an idea to create a spoken drama, and the first things that got done were translations of Chekhov and Ibsen and Shakespeare. So these were the sort of three pillars on which modern Japanese theater was formed. They were all playwrights vastly admired by Senda Koreya himself. Senda was born in 1904 and died in 1994, so I guess he was just 90 years old. He was a very gifted actor. Many would have said the greatest director of his generation. And he saw all of these various things going on and recorded them in his copious writings on the theater, which I'm still, of course, going through. Now, I never actually met Mr. Senda, but I had 4 or 5 sort of encounters with things about Mr. Senda, which I wanted to mention. The most recent one when I was in Tokyo last fall was at the Waseda Theater Museum in Tokyo. There was a magnificent exhibition about him in his honor. And there were photographs and stage set models and so forth that went on room after room after room. And you could see this extraordinary career spread out before you, with all the things that he had done, and how much Western theater he had introduced, and how many Japanese playwrights he had encouraged and produced their things and so forth. The first time I ever heard about Mr. Senda, and I knew almost nothing about Japan then, this was my typist days, I was teaching English at Hokkaido University for fun, and I have some wonderful graduate students. And they said, well, we know you like the theater, we're going to take you to the theater. And one of Mr. Senda's productions had traveled to Sapporo, of all places, and I saw Tartuffe of Molière. And I, of course, didn't know any Japanese at all. I'm supposed to know some now. I mean, it's a lifetime's effort, as some of you know, but for gaijin like us. But I certainly didn't know anything then. But I had happened to have seen a production of Tartuffe done by the members of the Comédie Française, so I sort of knew the way you were supposed to do it. Well, I thought this is the strangest Tartuffe I ever saw. The gestures were sort of kabuki-like and so forth, and I thought, what's going on here? And I sort of brooded about this for years, and then I came to realize, and I guess semioticians would explain this, is that he was speaking, he played Tartuffe himself, that he was speaking in a set of gestures which a Japanese audience would understand. So in effect he was using, perhaps unwittingly, sort of kabuki-like, larger-than-life motions and so forth and so on. And people loved it, and they understood it, and they loved the play. And he got a standing ovation. And it took me a long time to figure out that you don't have to do a play in the style of the French or the actor's studio to make it work. You do it in the style of the audience. And I began to realize how important the connection is between the audience and the performers. The next time that I sort of inadvertently ran up against something about Mr. Senda was, as Fred kindly mentioned, I translated first of all a play by Mr. Yamazaki called Zeami, which was a great hit in Japan in the early post-war period. And Mr. Senda had produced that production with Yamazaki as a young playwright at his Actors Theater in Tokyo. And so I heard a great deal from Mr. Yamazaki about what an extraordinary talent Mr. Senda was. And I was very pleased when I went to see this exhibition in Tokyo last year to see that there was a whole room full of photographs of Zeami. And it had been one of the great successes of the sort of intellectual theater in the early post-war period. Some of you I know have stayed in International House, and in fact you could have the same contact I have had with the Actors Theater, because that's Mr. Senda's theatrical company. Because if you go out to Roppongi, which is on the corner, and walk down the street, there it is. And so every time I would go to Japan, I would always make a trek down the street and look to see what was playing at the Hayuza. And it's still a landmark in Tokyo, and a very wonderful one. But the last, and I think the most touching sort of encounter I had with the spirit of Senda Koreya was 7 or 8 years ago. I was invited to give a lecture in Berlin about Mori Ogai, about the Japanese writer. And it was a very interesting experience. I had an extra day, and someone said, well, you know, East Berlin is now Berlin, and you ought to go over and look around, especially if that's where Ogai had lived, and you might enjoy going to the Bertolt Brecht archive. So I did, and realized that I wished I spoke German, because I don't. But I sort of made myself understood. And there was a very nice gentleman there, and he said, Brecht, he said, Japan, yes, wait. And he came back. And Senda had visited this archive when it was still East Germany, and he had recorded in elegant sort of Western characters detailed and thoughtful explanations of every production of Brecht that had been given in Japan. And so he said, we probably have better information here than they do in Tokyo. And I think that's quite true. I've never been able to find some of this. So I made furious notes until it was dinner time and I didn't get back. So Senda's been sort of around in my life a lot, but I never had the pleasure of meeting him, and I'm terribly sorry that I never did this. Let me tell you a little something about him, and then what I want to do is really talk about this major period in his life, at least one I've identified, because I think it raises some larger questions. So if you have any interest in various aspects of modern Japan, this might be of some interest to you. First of all, I should tell you just a little something about him. He was born in a fairly wealthy family and had the most extraordinary siblings. His father had traveled abroad and sort of encouraged his children, these four boys, to take an interest in the arts. You may have heard of his older brother, Ito Michio, who was a very famous dancer, who in fact was caught in World War I in Europe and had gone to study Jacques Dalcroze, the famous person who works on movement and so forth and so on, and ended up working with Yeats, and he performed at the Hawk's Well, which was written for him to be the lead in, Yeats's first great no play. And he eventually came to New York, and if you look him up in the archives of theater in New York in the 20s and 30s, he did all sorts of dance plays and all sorts of extraordinary things. Another brother of Senda was Ito Kisaku, who was arguably the greatest set designer in Japan up until the 60s. And I have a magnificent book of stage designs that he did, including a lot of productions for his brother. Ito Osuke, who is a musician, is a little bit less well known in the West, but has a great reputation in Japan, both as a sort of musical pedagogue and as a composer. So this is quite a family. Now, I mentioned all of these people are named Ito. Why is Mr. Senda not named Ito? His real name was Ito Kunio, but I think the way that he took the name Senda Koreya will tell you a great deal about his life, and it will bring me up to that crucial date in early 20th century Japanese history, the earthquake of 1923, when so much of the city was destroyed. A number of terrible things went on at that time. One of them was that and the reasons are obscure about all of this, but the Korean minority population was somehow blamed for some of the things that went on. And so there were a lot of Koreans who were killed, and there were all sorts of terrible things. And of course, most of the city burned and so forth. Senda was 19 years old, and he was sort of captured, and someone thought he was a Korean and started to do away with him, and he finally managed to escape. He was so upset, of course, at what happened to him, but more, I think, his society could show these sort of terrible tendencies, that he took a stage name of Senda Koreya. Senda is from Sendagaya Station, which is near where this happened. So Senda Koreya, so the closest he could come. So Koreans at Sendagaya. And if he hadn't been a Marxist before, he certainly became one then. So I'm on the list of 30 for a few minutes here. He went to Waseda University and started to study German literature, which he thought would be a good place to learn something about this. One of the things I don't know, and he's not mentioned in his autobiographical writings, although he's very generous in talking about other people, he doesn't mention Tsubuchi Shoyo particularly, whose name will come up later, and I might mention here now, was an extraordinary person who taught at Waseda University, and the museum, in fact, where the exhibition was shown about Senda is called the Tsubuchi Shoyo Museum. Tsubuchi Shoyo, among other things, translated all of Shakespeare's plays into Japanese, into these very elegant translations, which are still highly readable and very, very sort of florid and wonderful. And he was sort of the doyen by this time of teaching Shakespeare in Japan. So, I don't know whether Senda knew him or took courses with him. It would be interesting to know, but there's not much mention in his autobiography about this. In any case, he left the university because he decided that he was going to cast his die with the theater. So he joined as a research student at age 20 or 21 the Tsukiji Little Theater, which was founded by Osanai Kaoru, who was another major figure in the theater. When the earthquake, again, it's fun to get off on this, but I mustn't do that too much. When the earthquake destroyed virtually all the theaters in Tokyo, there was a very wealthy young man named Hijikata who was in Berlin at that time studying theater, and he decided to come back, and his story would make another fascinating lecture, but we mustn't do that. Anyway, he came back, and he built this theater in the Tsukiji area of Tokyo called the Tsukiji Little Theater, and it was probably the most well-equipped theater anywhere in Asia at that time, with all sorts of lighting and stage equipment and so forth and so on. And Osanai decided he would really center on making the modern theater work in Japan. He set up an actors training school and so forth, and Senda signed on as a student. He actually began acting there and did very well, according to some of the reviews I've checked. But he also was very interested in how to get an audience that he approved of, and so he began to set up sort of little workers' circles, and he would go to labor unions and get them to see if he could get people to come, and he would set up play reading groups and so forth. So he always had an interest in building the kind of audience that he wanted to find. But he thought he would really like to find out more about what things are like. So he went to Germany in 1927 with not a great deal of money. He had read about Piscator, some of these great left-wing directors in Japan, and he wanted to sort of see at first hand what these things were like. It would be fun, I haven't had a chance to do this yet, but it would be fun to translate bits of his memoirs from this particular period, because he had, by all accounts, no money whatsoever. And so he played extras in movies. Sometimes he had to be a Chinese or a Vietnamese or something, and he said, I adopted all sorts of accents, but it did pay the rent. Because, of course, the German film industry was very busy then, and he did all sorts of strange things. He was a janitor at one point, and on and on and on. And of course, he tried to see as much theater as he could, and he became very interested in this. And he really thought that Germany was an extraordinary place to be. He wrote at one point that in his memoir, he said, there was a certain balance struck, I thought, here in Germany, between, this is speaking in late 1920s, between the right and the left. And Berlin was really the center of world theater at that time. In Berlin, you could see the most important theater from all parts of the world being performed: Russian theater, French, or Italian. These were the years of relative economic stability for the Weimar Republic. But when Germany was swallowed up by the Great Depression, the Nazis began to gain power. I remember the Nazis coming by in a truck and firing their pistols into the headquarters of the German Communist Party, where I was drawing pictures for posters and handbills and so forth and so on. And he did actually join the Communist Party in Germany while he was there. He also went to the Soviet Union and saw some of those experiments. That's before the Stalinist clampdown. So he saw a lot of these very imaginative productions and became quite fascinated. And it would seem to me, reading through his descriptions of his own attitudes and so on, that what he came to the conviction was that art, if it's worth anything, it should be a vehicle to change people's minds, to make them think, not a vehicle for self-expression. Now, this is not exactly an idea we would have now, one way or the other, but it's a very honorable and I think very ambitious one. And so when he came back, that's what he tried to do. Now, he never met Brecht in Berlin, but he saw two plays of Brecht which moved him very much. One was the Threepenny Opera, which I'm going to talk about later, which is 1928, and then a very severe play by Brecht, some who know Brecht better than I say his most Marxist play, called in English The Measures Taken, which was written in 1930. Well, Senda came back in 1931, and he, of course, had hoped to work at the Tsukiji Little Theater again, but found that indeed, with Osanai's death, the theater had split up into two parts. So you had the very left-wing part and the sort of more artistic part. He wanted to combine them. That was always his idea. So he started a little theater company of his own, and he put on his first production, which was fairly well attended, actually, not surprisingly, perhaps, the Threepenny Opera of Brecht and Kurt Weill. Now, I don't know if you know the Threepenny Opera. I think it was done here this year. I believe I saw in the newspaper there was a production of it here in Los Angeles.
It's at the Odyssey.
Big part? Was it? Did you see it?
Yes.
Was it good? It's hard to bring it off. I'd like to get your opinions later because I'll tell you some of the things that he was up to here. Those of you who may know the Threepenny Opera, and if you don't, I certainly hope that you will. And the Kurt Weill score is one of the great 20th century treats of all time, of which there are now about 15 recordings. In any case, but if you know the original, you know that Brecht moved the story from, it's of course an adaptation of John Gay's original from 1728. So he moved it from London then to Victorian London as a way to sort of distance people from the material and yet bring it closer at the same time. Now Senda, in thinking over this, decided he would move it to Tokyo in the early Meiji period so that it would again be somewhat close, not exactly the same, but sort of close to a contemporary audience, just like it was, Victorian England was sort of close to Europe in the 1920s. And he called it the Kojiki Shibai, or the play of beggars. Now he was very, very committed to making this production work, and I was entranced to see set designs and costume designs and photographs and so forth. And it seems to have been fairly respectable production, but he had a great deal of trouble with it, and it's very touching to read his memoirs. And he said, basically the trouble with it is I could not find any performers who knew the style of acting or could sing. He said, we have actors who can act and singers who can sing, but we didn't have any singing actors. And he said, I have a terrible voice, but I played McKeith, the lead, myself, because I couldn't find anybody else. And I think that gave him a very, very powerful conviction, which goes all the way through the rest of his life, I think, that if the modern theater is going to work for this audience, it's going to make them change their minds into it, the performers have to have the skills to make it work. And he felt, as did so many other people in Japan at this time, including Kishida Kunio, the man that we talked about before, that you had good playwrights and you had perhaps a fine company, but the level of acting talent was not properly trained. And so he felt that he really should do something about that. But he was quite a good actor by all accounts. You should come and sit. I don't mean you should stand in the back. Are you really? And the second production that caused a great deal of interest, and again, I'll refer to this back in a few minutes, was a production in 1938 of Shakespeare's Hamlet. And that was his other, and he played Hamlet. And those were his two great roles before the war, although he played in many, many other plays. The production of Hamlet is particularly touching to read about because the government was being by this time, of course, quite repressive. It was just before World War II started. The war in China, of course, had already started, and they were censoring the play. They took out all the political references were taken out. At one point, they wanted to close the production down because, of course, Hamlet's stepfather is a sort of evil person, and you should not show that royalty could be evil. And so therefore the play was suspect. And so these are very, very difficult times. So he talks about, in his memoirs, sort of steering through all this and trying to get this thing done. But I think what he says in his memoir is extremely interesting, which is that it's remarkable that the government, by trying to censor Hamlet and these other things, showed how they worried about the power of the theater. It could have power to move people. Even if it was small audiences in Tokyo of the intelligentsia, still, it was something which they were afraid of. And so he realized that perhaps the theater would actually work. Well, by the 1940s, the theaters were all closed. Most of them were closed down, except ones that just did sort of artistic plays or did entertainment. Now, Senda had not joined the Communist Party while he was in Japan, but he was put in prison in any case from 1940 to 1942. And then he sort of recanted so he could get out and do something. But he describes, I don't know how accurately, that he was in effect under house arrest until the end of the war. He couldn't come and go very easily and so forth and so on. But one of the things that this time in prison, he said, did for him was that he realized that he had to take seriously this idea that for the theater to work in this context, you must train the actors properly. So he wrote a manual on acting. I have never seen this, but I'm told that it was in wide use in Japan until the 1970s. And I'm on the track of a copy now, so I'll let you know more about that if I find it. In 1944, so just before the end of the war, he decided that he would try to work on opening a theater. And so he and this bunch of like-minded people made a sort of proclamation to open the theater, the Actors Theater, named, of course, for what his interest was, or the Hayuza. His name is not on the manifesto because he was still sort of persona non grata, but they all worked very hard once the war was over and produced plays all over the place. Wherever they could find a theater. And he'd actually raised enough money by 1953 to build the Hayuza Theater. And I think one of the things that strikes an American, certainly somebody who's come to Los Angeles anyway, and reading about all these $1 million salaries for movie stars, is really quite interesting, because the way this theater was built and sustained afterwards, because it only seats about 300 people, as I recall, is that the people who perform in the plays would do television or film or something like that, and they would give, 30–40% of their salary to the Hayuza to keep it going. And so the acting was the core of what they wanted to do, and they were so idealistic that they weren't off, buying houses in Beverly Hills. They were doing this, and at considerable sacrifice, so that the theater could go on. And I think this is, from a contemporary American point of view, really quite an interesting thing. Now, one of the things that he wanted to do, that is Mr. Senda wanted to do with his theater, was to train people to do a variety of acting styles, and therefore he did, in fact, Molière. He did lots of Shakespeare. He did Beaumarchais, especially Marriage of Figaro, the sort of plays that had a kind of revolutionary undertone, Gogol and so forth. And he also did everything he could to get contemporary Japanese playwrights working. So he got Abe Kobo, who some of you may know as a novelist, who's an excellent playwright, a number of his avant-garde plays, Tanaka Chikao, who wrote the play about Nagasaki, the Head of Mary, the Catholic play, a lot of his plays. And he even produced some plays by Mishima Yukio, whom he disliked personally, because he said Mishima has no social conscience, but the plays are good, and so he put some plays on. And to these he added a name that had not been heard in Japan before, Brecht. And he probably did more than any other person to introduce the Japanese public to Bertolt Brecht. And his two most important projects during these years of the 60s, which is where I'm focusing all of this on, were his reworkings, if you like, of the Threepenny Opera and Hamlet. So in effect, he revisited these things that he'd struggled with before the war and tried to mount them again in a way that he thought would be useful. Now, at first, one might not see what the relevance would be of Brecht and Shakespeare. I mean, how do they go together? Why was he equally interested in both of them? And I think in order to understand that, one has to know something about how people viewed Shakespeare at this time. He wrote again in one of his autobiographical essays, he was talking about Shakespeare and what Shakespeare meant to the Japanese. Shakespeare is still probably the most popular playwright in a way in Japan. There are always productions of Shakespeare, everywhere, all the time. And he was explaining this in an essay he wrote in the 1980s, and he said, "We have undertaken many efforts in our own country to create, in the real sense of the word, a modern drama. All of these can be considered as extensions of the road first opened up by Shakespeare, and by Tsubushi Shogyo, the man who translated those plays, whom I mentioned. And so it is that this playwright, born in Stratford, England, feels closer to us and to our own work than the great men of our own tradition, Zeami, Chikamatsu, Mokuami, No, and Kabuki. They seem far, but Shakespeare seems close. This is in no way related to the fact that our new theater appears Western in style. Rather, it feels to us as though Shakespeare is our own contemporary." And I think that is very true. It sounds like things that were written by Western critics at the same period, but I think Senda believed that very much. So he treated Shakespeare as a modern writer. One of the things that when you read about his years in Germany also comes up is that Shakespeare was already extremely popular in Germany, and he saw a number of Shakespearean productions there. They used to talk, I think, from the 19th century on as Shakespeare in Germany was sort of our Shakespeare. And I've had German people tell me that the translations of Shakespeare, the 19th century translations, are more beautiful than Shakespeare's original, to which I always sort of smiled thinly, but I can't judge, I don't know. And in the 1920s, I found that there were a number of sort of avant-garde Shakespeare productions, some of which Senda saw, in which, as one director put it, we want to move Shakespeare beyond the Victorian realm of bourgeois self-gratification. So this would be right up Senda's line. Now, what about Brecht? Was he interested in Shakespeare? Well, it turns out more than you would think. Brecht did, from what I know of him, and I'm certainly not an expert on Brecht, seems to have been most interested in Brecht. That is, he loved to talk about himself, but he didn't really waste too much time with anybody else. However, when one goes through the biography, I went through several of them, you find really quite an interesting sort of nascent homage to Shakespeare, can I put it that way? One of the things he did as a teenager was to set up a puppet theater, which is a lot of famous theater people have done that, to sort of do things without having to do actors and so forth. And what is the play which he staged as a teenager? Hamlet. And he did it all over the place. So that was a sort of interesting beginning. In 1924, by which time he was already becoming rather famous, he did a famous, or some writers would say infamous, production of a play by Marlowe, Shakespeare's contemporary, called Edward II. And he did it, he said, because everybody's doing Shakespeare, so I'll do Marlowe. It was very Brechtian. And he took his major line, which he always applied to Shakespeare for as far as I can tell, the rest of his career. He said, these classics are the raw material that we can use to do what we want to. And he would go on to sort of do this. But he did a production for radio, which was, of course, then very important, of Macbeth in 1927, which was widely broadcast and rebroadcast and so forth and so on. So he was doing that. And in 1928, he co-directed a performance of his favorite Shakespeare play, Coriolanus, one that we don't see so often, but is a play with a lot of political implications and so forth. He was dissatisfied with this production and kept trying, and came back to it again and again. In fact, in 1951, he tried to prepare. He was by that time living in East Berlin, and he was running the Berliner Ensemble and so forth. He decided to actually mount the play, and he began working on it and going over it and sketching it out and so forth. But he died in 1956, and his company put it on sort of in his honor afterwards, and it became one of Brecht's most famous productions. He didn't write a great deal about Shakespeare, but in 1954 he wrote what theater people often read and find quite interesting, a thing that's usually called in English the Little Organum for the Theater, which is sort of his principles, at least his principles of that time in his life, of what makes great theater and so forth. And he actually mentions Shakespeare's name and says he's a great writer. Amazing. He never does that sort of thing. And I think Shakespeare and Aristotle are the only two names, non-Brecht names, that get in this essay. And then in 1954, when, toward the end of his life, when Brecht was writing about the Caucasian chalk circle, one of his most famous plays, he also praises Shakespeare and said, Shakespeare's really the model for us all. And I thought that was really very seemly of him to mention that. So in effect, Shakespeare was a focus both for Senda, who saw Shakespeare as a contemporary person, and Brecht, who saw him as the great sort of Western dramatist. Now, what about these two productions? And let me preface this by saying there's always this question of, can you go home again? That is, the production of the Threepenny Opera and of Hamlet in the 1930s took place in one kind of context in Japan. In the 1960s, Japan was a very different place. Would these still work? And I think this is the question that will lead me to a couple of tentative conclusions here at the end. And in fact, he wrote about this himself. He did sponsor a number of Brecht productions, and he had other directors. The Caucasian Chalk Circle was wildly popular for years in Japan at the Hayuza, but he did not direct it. So therefore, he didn't write a lot of essays, but he did write them about the Threepenny Opera for his 1962 production. And it's extremely interesting to read through these essays in Japanese and see what he's saying. He was very worried about this. He thought perhaps Japan was too different. First of all, he said people know the film of the Threepenny Opera with Lotte Lenya, Kurt Weill's wife, and so forth and so on. I don't know how many of you may have seen it. It's quite remarkable. Done in the early 1930s. Brecht disliked the film very much because there were changes made in it. The political message was somewhat softened. And of course, Senda wanted the political message to be very strong. And he said if people have seen the film, then they'll think it's more entertainment, whereas this is a play to teach you how evil society is and so forth and so on. And he was also worried, I think, possibly correctly, that Kurt Weill's music is so engaging and so delightful and so amusing that people would pay attention to the music and not to Brecht's scenario. And I think that's a danger with that particular piece. He said, like Brecht, I want my Threepenny Opera production to be a vehicle for teaching. Well, that's not how you feel when you hear Kurt Weill's music. And in fact, in Brecht's case, he went through various productions in his own writing, and he and I think Senda agreed that the only one which seemed satisfactory was one that was done by the great Italian director Giorgio Strehler in 1955. And I was able to find, excuse me, a little article about that production, and it's fascinating to read what they say about this. Brecht said, Strehler, of course, is an enormous figure in European theater, and not so well known here, but a man of immense accomplishment. Brecht told him, Strehler was not quite sure how to mount this thing either in Italy at this particular time. And Brecht said, remember, to laugh is to criticize, and you must not make it too pretty. You can't just enjoy it. You have to, the lesson has got to come home in it. So Strehler had the idea, this was sort of an interesting idea, they didn't do this, but he said, well, let's move the production again. He said, from London, Victorian London, let's move it to New York about 1905 and have Italian immigrants be the characters. Again, trying to, sort of move it closer. And it would, of course, the Italian immigrants connect to Italy, so that would be a very interesting. I didn't see the Gangs of New York, but that sort of thing. Brecht thought that's sort of all right, but don't do that, so he didn't do it. And he kept stressing the idea to Giorgio Strehler. He said, the theme of this Threepenny Opera is the thief is a bourgeois, because if you see this, you know that Mac the Knife, who is the one who runs all the beggars and so forth, is always impeccably dressed and so forth. And he said, so the thief is a bourgeois, but can you reverse this? Or is the bourgeois a thief? And that's the message that he wanted to get across. So he kept urging this, and Strehler evidently succeeded. Brecht liked the production very much, and said one of the reasons that he liked it was because a lot of working class people came to see it, which is just what he had in mind. Now, as I say, I don't know how many of you have seen the Threepenny Opera, heard the music, but I can't help mention my own experience with it, because it's a work that's attracted me in my entire adult life. I was lucky enough, again, I'm so old, right, to have seen this remarkable production of the Threepenny Opera in the mid-1950s at the Theatre de Lys in New York with Lotte Lenya, Kurt Weill's then widow, who played the female lead. This was the day of South Pacific. I mean, I had never been to a piece of musical theater where you were told how corrupt your thinking was. I mean, it was wonderful. You know, I had no idea you could do this in the theater. We were doing sort of the equivalent of, Neil Simon 2 generations before. It was the most wonderful thing I ever saw. But by the same token, it's fascinating that Eric Bentley, who was one of the great sort of specialists on Brecht and so on, was very, very critical of the production. I was able to meet him at the University of Maryland, and I asked him why. I said it would transform my life. He said, because, he said, they used Mark Blitzstein's translation, and it's too clever. And he said, and it's a brilliant translation, and the things rhyme, and the songs just sing themselves. They sound like they're written in English. He said because they blunt the message, and the message is to make the audience suffer. Well, it's difficult to make the audience suffer. When Laurence and I were living in St. Louis, the Repertory Theater there did a wonderful production of the Threepenny Opera. It has a small orchestra. They had very good singers doing this and so forth. And I remember after the very devastating second act finale where, all of society is pointed out to be corrupt and so forth, there was a woman with an enormous fur coat on, almost like out of those Weimar Germany, cartoons. And she said to her husband, that music is just so catchy, I just think this is great. And I thought, well, I guess you can't educate an audience. And I think this is the question, can you or can't you? You couldn't in St. Louis 15 years ago, anyway, I can see. In any case, Senda had the idea that he would do his best with this. By the way, I should mention, if you're readers of the New York Times, you know that Threepenny Opera is opening in New York in about 3 weeks, I think. This is a translation by Wallace Shawn, that wonderful actor in My Dinner with Andre and all that sort of thing. We'll see what he does with it. But it would be hard to better, I think, this magnificent Blitzstein translation, or to me, anyway. And Senda wrote a long note to go in the program all about this. And so he really did his homework. He made some extraordinary observations. He said, for example, when the original Beggars opera by John Gay was done in 1728, it was written at the time of the rise of the bourgeoisie in England, and it was extremely popular. In fact, I don't know exactly if it's true, but it's often been said, even in sort of erudite circles, that the success of the Beggars opera was so great that it made Handel stop writing operas and start writing oratorios. So I guess you can say we've got the Messiah because of the Beggars opera. I'm not quite sure that's right, but it sounds good anyway. But he said, but in Weimar, Germany, in 1928, when I saw it, he said the bourgeoisie was collapsing in Weimar, Germany. It had risen, and now it was collapsing, but it was still there. And he said, so the idea that fraud masks its compassion might actually work. And then he really made some very shrewd observations. He said, for example, if I look at Weimar, Germany, he was there, of course. He said one of the things that was going on there was a revival of Handel operas, which hadn't been done really for several hundred years. And he said, I think they appealed to music lovers because the society was falling apart. But in these Handel operas, you have kings and, running the countries and all these sort of regal things going on. And it was elegant music, and it was sort of escapism. There was no social content. And then he talked about other operas which were being done at the same time by Hindemith and Johnny Spitauf of Krennek and so forth, and said these are, of course, attempts to do modern things, but they have too much heroic stuff in them, and so they don't also match up to what the time is like. So he really did understand the setting in which he had first seen it, and it was really very imaginative understanding of this. And just like Brecht, Senda said in this essay for the program that he wanted the Threepenny Opera's music to be a service function, to work with the text and so forth. Now, he was also very irked, and this is actually a more important point that I'll make just here at the end, because American musicals were starting to be done in Japan at that time. And he said, I detest American musicals. Why? Not that they're not interesting, but because they are, what's the word that he used? They're too personal, they don't have any political side in them, and they're too sentimental. And he said they don't face society. It would have been interesting, and I've hunted around, but I've not yet been able to find out whether or not he ever made any comments about West Side Story. An American company was imported to do West Side Story there in 1964, and I wonder whether he would have, that's the closest we've ever gotten to what he wanted, and I wonder whether he would have liked it or not, but he didn't say anything. In any case, this Threepenny Opera was mounted. Now, in his repertory company, things were done as a repertory theater does, like the Actors Gang here or something. So the play goes on for so many months, and then something else comes. But it was revived again and again and again, and it was toured. And it went not only to the obvious places, to Kobe, Osaka, Kyoto, but it went to Nagoya, Hamamatsu, and a small town called Mishima, no relation to the writer, which is near the Izu Peninsula. And it was revived again for quite a long time, and then sent to Yokohama, and they were very grumpy they hadn't gotten it in the first place. So obviously, in some context, it was a great success. Now, the Hamlet in 1964 is very interesting. Again, he had played Hamlet, and he was, of course, not to do that again. He directed it, but he put on his Brecht glasses to look at Shakespeare, and he said, in that statement that I read you, he wanted to see Shakespeare's Hamlet as a contemporary play. But he said, I'm like Brecht, I want to remove all the interiority and all the heroism from Hamlet. Well, it seems like a contradiction in terms, but he was very determined to do that. And he did interesting things with it. Laurence and I saw the production, actually, in Kobe. First of all, I don't know how well you know the play, but if you see it in the theater, the first thing that usually goes is all the Fortinbras things at the beginning. There's a sort of political frame around the play. He stressed that. He cut other things and left all the politics in, which most of us are quite unfamiliar with, which I thought was quite interesting. And he was very clear to make Hamlet a product of social forces, not just a personal thing. And the play was very successful. But there were interesting problems. He had a very prestigious cast. The actor who played Hamlet was Nakudai Tatsuya, whom some of you may know from Kurosawa's films, a marvelous actor. And this is a sort of aside to what I'm saying, but Mr. Nakudai wrote a little essay about performing in Hamlet. He had done modern theater and done film, but he had never done a Shakespeare play before. And he said, he had given up a film because he was not feeling very well. He was ill or something. So he took this on. And he said, this is the hardest thing I've ever tried to do in my life. The reason, he said, is that he said, I've seen Shakespeare, but I've never acted in it. And he said, you know, as a Japanese man, we're not supposed to talk. You just sort of grunt, you know, something. And he said, but Hamlet has these long soliloquies. He said, no Japanese man talks like that. So he said, they might say, but they don't say, it's charming to read this thing. So he said, how am I supposed to do this and be real at the same time? He was really quite remarkable, and he was very athletic, and Senda had him running all over the stage and cutting things down and so forth and so on. But he said it was an experiment he might not repeat, and I don't know that he ever did Shakespeare again. But he, from a gaijin's viewpoint, I thought he was really quite wonderful. And again, this production toured to Kobe, Osaka, and Yokohama, and so forth and so on, and revived a number of times. Now, what does all this mean? And if I can just have another 5 minutes maybe, I'll try to make the small point I'd like to make here. I'd like to come back to the question of audiences. What did the audiences get out of it? I think this was the moment of Senda's greatest influence, and it was the beginning of his greatest fall, because there were 3 different things that happened in post-war Japan, completely unlike what happened in pre-war Japan. The first of them is something which I suppose you could say is American in nature. And I think it can best be symbolized by saying that in 1963, so halfway between these productions, a very beautiful theater was built in Tokyo called the Nisei Gekijo, near the Imperial Hotel, and it's still one of the most elegant theaters in Japan. And is still highly visible and so forth. But the principle on which this theater was built was not like the repertory companies, not like the Hayuza, where you hired a bunch of actors and you do this month and you do this next month and so on. It was done in a very different sort of structure. It was done along the American lines, where you have a producer who hires performers for a particular thing. And indeed, Hamlet was done at the Nisei Theater in Tokyo. A whole new way of doing things. So you did the producer, director, actor sort of structure. And what happened within a few months is that the directors, the very shrewd people who directed the Nisei Theater, began to go outside the lines, so that there was a remarkable production of Richard III of Shakespeare, in which they hired a kabuki actor to play the lead. No one had ever hired a kabuki actor to do anything but kabuki. And they began to break up these sort of structures which had continued on. And the modern theater was very much like the traditional theater. Kabuki actors trained their sons, who trained their sons. No actors trained their sons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was a whole new thing. And I think it was really the influence of the American model, which many Japanese are very familiar with that way. And so this whole repertory theater idea, which has sustained Senda Korea, was beginning to fall apart, and did, not too long after that. The second thing is perhaps a German influence, I'm not sure. It's the idea of the theater for the masses. When Senda was in Germany, he saw this, I can't pronounce German right, Volksbühne, I guess, which is a sort of theater in which laboring people could buy cheap tickets to come to the theater, and they would form these groups and so forth. Well, there was a sort of Japanese equivalent set up, and Senda thought this was a wonderful idea, in 1948, called the Kurosha Engeki Kyokai Rouen, and it was called Rouen for short. Everybody talked about Rouen. And it was supposed to be for the people. Those of you who are interested in these sorts of theater structures, there's a wonderful book by Thomas Havens, who's a very fine scholar on Japan, who wrote a book on the post-war arts, and there's an excellent description of how all this works in there. And so Rouen would underwrite these productions for the working class, and that's how they would often sell out. If Rouen bought the tickets, then they could fill the theater, and the production could run, and so forth and so on. And this helped everybody out. However, by the time of this Hamlet production, maybe even by the time of the Threepenny Opera production, something very interesting was discovered with the Rouen people. First of all, they would sell all the tickets, but it's not the workmen who came. It was the middle-class office workers who came, who also were part of the union, so therefore they could get the tickets. And their interest in going to these plays was not so much to be indoctrinated with politics, but to have a cultural evening out. And there was still a kind of a yearning, I think, and I think there still is in Japan to some extent, to know more about world culture. And so going to see a Shakespeare play or hear a Beethoven symphony or something like that is sort of striking a blow for a larger world in Japan. And that's why people would go to these. And it really undercut the whole idea of this sort of Marxist approach to things. People loved to go see the classics because they were world classics, not because they might learn something about how to overthrow the company they worked for. So this, which Brecht would have loved them to do. So this was another sea change, I think, that was very, very important. And then finally, and perhaps, and again, Carol's book addresses this brilliantly, is the sort of rise of the new avant-garde in Japan, which is completely different. In 1960, there were extraordinary demonstrations for the U.S.-Japan security treaty, whether it should be renewed or not. And President Eisenhower was not able to go to Japan. It was too dangerous. It was an extraordinary moment. And all of this turmoil was going on and so forth. And in the midst of this turmoil, a lot of theater people got started as students, mostly from Waseda University. So we go back to Tsubuyoshi and then Senda and now these other people. And some of the great names in modern and contemporary Japanese theater started off as radical students at this time. People like Betsuyaku, the playwright, and Shimizu Kunio, and directors like Ninagawa, who does all these extraordinary productions and just took Macbeth to New York 2 years ago and so forth and so on. And these people had no interest in theater companies or in sort of world classics, at least not at that moment, or anything else. They were triumphantly going to do their own thing, and what's more, they would do whatever they wanted. And I think as time went by, as you sort of watched what went on, and Carol describes all these things so well in her book, I think you could see the end of the old structure when Toho, which is a big commercial movie and TV company, hired Suzuki Tadashi, the leading avant-garde director in Japan, to do Sweeney Todd of Stephen Sondheim in Tokyo, and sold it out for weeks, which is a long time in Japan, and took it on tour. That would have been unthinkable in Senda's time, that something like that would go on. First of all, a sort of left-wing director would never, an American musical? What is all of this? By 1962, Betsuyaku Minoru, now the doyen playwright in Japan, had written a remarkable play about the bombings in Hiroshima called Elephant, which David Goodman has translated into English. Terayama himself had begun to do his early work and so forth. So the whole climate was changing, and I think sort of leaving Senda kind of behind, or starting to leave him behind, right at the height of his own creativity. I'm still studying his later career. He was able to write quite a bit about that, and I've just started to go through this material. He was regarded as a figure of enormous importance and like a sort of a teacher to everybody right up until the end of his life. And so it'll be fascinating as I go through this, and I'll report on this later, hopefully. But I think if stepping back for a minute and thinking about the theater as a way to sort of reflect Japanese society, it seems to me that in this long period from really the 1920s to the 1990s, he was the bridge that sort of guided all of this through in some ways, with this long commitment to social values, social justice, and so forth, which the avant-garde people have every bit as much as he, if not more. But I think he also did some things inadvertently that have made the Japanese theater so important today. One of them is that, in Japanese culture, one of them is that he did plays by Shakespeare and Brecht and modern Japanese playwrights like Abe Kobo, which were not in the realistic style. They're not in the Ibsen-Chekhov style at all. And so he began to show to these youngsters who would see his productions in the 60s and so on, that you didn't have to do acting like the old models, like the Ibsen and the Chekhov and so forth. You could do other sorts of things. And in effect, he was trying to do his version, I think, of Brecht's epic acting. And that has translated into these productions that are world famous now of Ninagawa and Suzuki and so forth, which are now being seen everywhere. And I think it would be very interesting. I'm not competent to do this, but if we could find an actor who could look at the Ninagawa things and then look at how Brecht was doing how Senda was doing his sort of Brechtian acting, to see whether there wasn't a sort of congruence there of some kind. This was a sort of way of teaching things. But when you look at the contemporary Japanese theater and see all of the interesting things that are going on, I think Senda helped make all of this possible. I saw a remarkable videotape last summer. I don't know if they came to Los Angeles, they toured America, but there was a troupe called Kunauka, and they are absolutely remarkable, and they brought a play around a couple of years ago. but this was a new production done in Japan of Medea, the Greek tragedy, and it was set in Meiji Japan, and the figure of Medea was a Korean woman. Now, it's a brilliant idea to sort of transmute these things into a way that would make the public pay attention. You could not pay attention to that, and to see how the play worked. And when Medea says, "I love my children, but you have betrayed me," to the Prime Minister of Japan or whatever, it's very striking. And it's, I think in some way, it's Senda's ghost who's happily hovering around that. And that he's the one that, by sticking up for these ideals for so very long, made, in some ways, he backstopped all the wonderful things that go on now. So I will certainly stop talking. I've talked too long, but thank you very much.